I do want to briefly touch on some topics that I thought about writing a piece on. In some cases, even got started on doing the piece and ultimately decided not to make into its own topic and discuss why. And the first couple ones are ones having to do with President Trump and some of the things that he said. Specifically, the Robert E. Lee statue and taking that down, and where Trump was condemning white supremacists, but many people felt he wasn't condemning them strongly enough. And then also the time immediately prior to the 2024 elections when Trump made the comment about using the military against radical leftists if necessary, if they were being violent after they saw the results of the election. The reason I decided ultimately not to write about those two things is because I am hesitant to focus too much on Trump. I already do have a couple pieces written about him. There's the Is Trump Disastrous for Free Speech, and then also the E. Jean Carroll case. And I know Trump has done reprehensible things. And I believe that you can sort of recognize that people did bad things, but also recognize when someone's quotes are being taken out of context and misrepresented. But I do get the impression that there are people out there that kind of disagree with that they have this idea of like, once you have proven you were a bad person and beyond redemption, then all's fair. All's fair. You can misrepresent them all you want, and I don't care if that's not really what he said because he's a bad person anyways. And I didn't want to give people too much reason to turn away and stop paying attention and stop listening. And I thought if I came across as a fervent Trump supporter that could turn people away. Having said that, I do think those two cases I named are cases where his words were very much taken out of context and twisted and misrepresented. I think it is good to go back to the original source, the original things that he said and the context in which he said them in. And I mean, look, like he's said some bad stuff. He's done some bad stuff. Let's stick to the legitimately bad stuff to criticize him on and not make up other stuff to criticize him on. That's my thought. So the next one is the Great Barrington Declaration. And this is something that my father actually told me about. It was in 2020. Basically, it had to do with COVID. It was some very well-respected professors at esteemed universities who disagreed with how the COVID pandemic was being handled. And they wrote a declaration, they signed it, they were trying to get support for it, and this stuff was getting basically suppressed and censored, and it's very much in line with the stuff I was making videos about. And the reason I decided not to talk about it was because I already had a whole host of stuff addressing the poor handling of COVID-19 and the stuff around it. The lab leak theory, the story of Jennifer Say and her being canceled, the piece on the vaccine and the menstrual cycles. And I mean, COVID did happen. I mean, at this point, it's the beginning of 2025. So like it happened years ago. And I thought publishing another piece that was harping on the same topic that was several years old was just kind of overkill. And that while the Great Barrington Declaration was a very valid example of exactly what I'm speaking out against, that it wasn't really going to advance my case very much. The final thing is RFK Jr. RFK Jr. is a very interesting figure. The reason I didn't talk about him was a very similar reason as to President Trump, because he's divisive. I don't want to push people away too much. Personally, my opinions on RFK Jr., they're different from President Trump. I do think in many cases when we see RFK Jr. saying what is insane stuff, what we are actually reading are journalists' interpretations of what he's said as opposed to what he's actually said. I would encourage you, when you hear about the stuff he says, try to find the original quote, because not in all cases, but in many cases, it is more nuanced. Man, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but you know what? This is the last one. Let's do it. The biggest criticism I've heard about why people don't like RFK Jr. is his being anti-vaccine, encouraging people not to get, I believe it was the polio vaccine, and then people like dying from polio or whatever. Is that he encouraged people not to get vaccines. They didn't get the vaccines, and then they were harmed by it. And I have many thoughts on why I disagree with that. First of all, at least RFK Jr.'s current stance is he's not telling people don't get vaccines. He's encouraging people like look into it and research it and be careful with it. You can Google this and look into this yourself. Like that may not be what his stance always was, but that is what it is right now. If he has influenced people to not get vaccines, that is influencing. That it was not his responsibility to give people the vaccines or to withhold it from them. I think if people were influenced by him and chose not to do something that ended up making them sick, they need to take responsibility for that. And the final thing is medical error is the third leading cause of death in the United States. So if you want to talk about people who have good intentions but ultimately end up directly harming people medical-wise and even killing them, you gotta hate the whole medical establishment. Because they are trying to help, but really, like, there are not a lot of safeguards in place for finding the root cause of medical errors and making sure that does not happen again. But this was a big tangent. The big thing that I wanted to talk about with regards to RFK Jr. was his comment about chemicals in the water turning people trans. And this comes up a lot as, like, one of the most absurd things that he's ever said. And what I think a lot of people may not be aware of is that chemicals in the environment have been linked to endocrine disorders. There are chemicals called endocrine disruptors. They can cause endocrine disorders. There has also been research that links endocrine disorders to atypical gender presentation. And basically, there's the research out there is like, you have certain stuff that's just contradicted by later studies, or like, you know what, like they may present atypically, but they're not actually transgender. And like, you know, even so, basically it just ended up like there's not a lot of good research out there to support what RFK Jr. is saying. But what he is saying in many cases is just to look into things further, because clearly something's happening. A lot more people are having gender dysphoria than they have in the past, and something's causing it. And people aren't really suggesting a whole lot of theories other than that, like, oh, people are now just able to admit to it. I think when you were suggesting that there's not a lot of research on something and to look into it further, that is inherently a hard thing to prove in either direction. You know, like, how do you prove that you shouldn't do more research on something without doing research on it? And how do you prove that a claim is legitimate if there's no research out there to support it, and that is what that person is saying anyways? I do think it is good for people out there to think outside the box and to make these sort of outrageous suggestions of like, hey, we should look into this stuff, because you have too many people who are just skeptics and in lockstep with like what the current scientific opinion is, and you're not going to get creative and advance and look into new things and really just sort of prove or disprove different hypotheses. So I'm sorry, that was kind of a long tangent, but that was another thing that I wanted to write about. And then ultimately I just thought it was going to weaken my argument. You know, I don't want to talk about stuff where there's not a lot of research that has been done. I prefer to sort of show examples of when you don't do the research initially and then you do them and you realize that you were off base initially. So in addition to all of that, I also wanted to address a few topics that were suggested to me that I decided were just out of scope for this. And one of them came from my boyfriend, Dustin, who is very much into cryptocurrency and is an advocate of it and thinks that a lot of people just, I guess, don't, like, they misunderstand it. And honestly, I think he wanted me to do a deep dive because he's really excited about it and he just wanted to talk about it with me and me know what he's talking about. I could be wrong. Regardless, while cryptocurrency is controversial, I don't feel like the cause of the controversy really has to do with like censorship or misrepresentation in the media. So I chose not to write about it because I just didn't think it fit my theme. My friend Ken, he sent me some emails talking about the Constitution and the Constitution's role in some of the political issues of the day. They were very well-researched, well-thought-out emails. I thought he made good points and had good stuff to say. But again, it was the same thing of like, even though this is compelling, this is not the message I'm trying to get across. This is just something different. And the final thing, this was also a conversation I had with Ken, is I guess in one of my first videos, I think I made some sort of comment about being a Republican. And he had said to me, well, wait, I thought you were a Democrat, or at least like a libertarian. I didn't think you were a Republican. And he's kind of right. Like I responded to him explaining why I struggle to categorize myself in terms of political labels and where my head was in terms of my political ideology. And he suggested to me that that would be a good thing to communicate to my audience. And I thought about doing it, but ultimately I felt uncomfortable with it because I was trying to, like I specifically said in my introduction, I was not trying to promote a particular ideology. I was just trying to draw awareness to censorship and misinformation and bias. In some of the Facebook comments and responses and stuff like that, I have talked about some of my opinions, but I tried to at least keep it to a minimum in my videos and my blog posts. I honestly, I may do a season 2, and at some point, if people are interested in hearing my personal views, I may get into that, which really brings me to the final thing that I want to address, which is saying that this is the end of the rabbit hole. And what's going on here is just that this is something, I mean, I have a full-time job and I'm doing this outside of work. And when I started on this project, it was around the holidays, and I had PTO that I had to take by the end of the year. I had a holiday time, and it was a little more manageable to fit in extensive research and recording and writing while I was having a full-time job. I've gotten to the point where it's just getting hard to keep up. I do still have a list on my phone of like probably about half a dozen topics that I'm interested in at least researching further, and if it pans out that way, that I may be interested in writing and recording some more pieces. I need a break right now, but we'll see. Maybe I'll be back. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you and having you listen through the screen and conversing with some of you guys, either in person or personal message or Facebook comments or email or what have you. This was very mentally invigorating, and I loved having this opportunity.